Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Tinisch Hollins. She is the Executive Director of Californians for Safety and Justice, the state's leading public safety advocacy organization. Welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me.
So, just as a brief introduction, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what Californians for Safety and Justice does?
Sure. I'm a native San Franciscan. I've been a policy advocate and community organizer for a couple of decades. I won't date myself, but I got engaged in this work really out of a desire to see community safety pulled to the front of conversations about how to deal with crime and violence. I grew up in San Francisco in a neighborhood called Bayview Hunters Point, which is, very similar to a lot of south sides of a lot of famous cities like South Central LA or South Side of Chicago. Beautiful communities full of diverse folks, Black folks, folks of color, working class folks. But especially after the the war on drugs, saw a lot of devastation to my community. And so my work has always been centered around bringing the voices of people who are most impacted by those issues into conversations about how we create solutions. I joined Californians for Safety and Justice as the executive director in 2021 and picked up the mantle of carrying our state policy advocacy work around criminal justice reform with an eye towards how we bring community safety to the forefront. And we do that by organizing the voices of crime victims and survivors who are underrepresented but come from communities that are most impacted by crime and violence. So through our network, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and through our network of individuals who are living with old records and convictions called Time Done, we are able to bring those voices into conversations around community safety and identify barriers to safety at the community level. Our work has also championed a lot of very historic legislation, one of which is Prop 47. And we continue to promote that work as an opportunity for us to change the state's over-reliance on jails and prisons and the criminal justice system for safety. So that's a little bit about me and the work that I do.
So, you already mentioned Prop 47. Can you tell people who might not be aware? Some folks are national anyway, who tune in this show. What is Prop 47?
So Proposition 47 was passed by California voters in 2014. The intention behind this legislation was to reduce California's jail population, which at the time was completely overwhelmed and overburdened with hundreds of thousands of individuals incarcerated for low-level crimes. What Prop 47 did was change some of the sentencing for low-level crimes from felony to misdemeanors, particularly around things like petty theft. The idea was that the savings from having folks warehoused in jail and prison could be reallocated to prevention programs, drug treatment, schools, things that will actually intervene and interrupt some of those low-level offenses. It also created opportunities for folks to get credits for participating in certain programs that would help them with reduced sentencing.
So, why is this a controversial bill or proposition, I guess?
Well, to be honest, since 2014, Prop 47 has been blamed for a lot of things, from a rise in crime to bad weather in California. But the truth is that the issues that most folks are concerned about, especially right now, like organized retail theft, like homelessness, like addiction, these things are all symptomatic of the state still not having the correct infrastructures to deal with those issues. We have seen a rise in certain types of crime after the pandemic. And that is to be expected. When we had a global public health crisis, we had families and communities destabilized. Many folks lost employment and housing and were permanently displaced. And people who were already vulnerable were cut off from, social services and daily programs that they really needed to stabilize their lives. Prop 47, for folks who are not big fans of criminal justice reform, really challenges this notion that jails and prisons and the criminal justice system are the way, and in some instances, the only way that we deal with low level crime. We already have proof and evidence that tougher sentencing and the tough on crime approach didn't create safety. Before 2014, it won't create it after. But we do have proof and evidence that when folks receive the right interventions, when they do get access to treatment beds, when we have effective prevention programs at the community level, especially in schools for young people and folks who are disenfranchised, that we see crime rates go down. And we actually did see crime rates go down after Prop 47. So in this moment, what we're seeing is a lot of political posturing and a lot of desperation, and rightfully so on the desperation, because many people do feel unsafe. But the notion that we are unsafe because of this one piece of legislation is what we are pushing back against. We know that the issue is much bigger than that.
So the folks that have opposed this have been able to qualify a ballot measure for November. What will that ballot measure do? It doesn't completely roll back what Prop 47 did, but it does change things.
Yes, it is posing to change some things about Prop 47. I think one of the main pieces of this legislation is to remove some of the things that we did around low level crime and bring them back to felonies. It would also reduce the felony threshold for petty theft. Um, in addition to the stuff that does around petty theft, it also does some things around fentanyl, specifically around that drug, being able to charge folks with deeper offenses and create felony strikes. And then there's some things around forced treatment. These are not things that are long-term solutions. In fact, they would do the same thing that we saw happen before 2014, which is criminalize all of these issues and overburden our jails and prisons with folks who are ill and folks who need treatment, but the state still doesn't have the capacity to provide that treatment.
So one of the big things that Prop 47 did was, at the time it was passed, 2014, California probably had about the lowest felony threshold in the country. It was at $400, and it hadn't changed in 40 years or so. And it brought it up to $950. And that's gotten a lot of attention as disincentivizing people from committing these crimes, because some folks are arguing, well, it's the equivalent of a ticket, which is ludicrous. The interesting thing is that even at $950, California is one of the lowest thresholds in the country. I think it's like 12th or something like that. And states like Texas have a threshold of over $2,000, and Florida as well. So, the idea that this is driving the retail theft is crazy, right?
Yeah, well, the math is not mapping, right? If this is the argument that the reason why we saw an increase in certain type of crime in California is because of the felony threshold, then we have evidence, to your point, in other states where the threshold is higher. We have to really pay attention to the other issues, the underlying issues that are driving this type of crime in California. The inflation, especially after the pandemic. I mean, anybody who has to grocery shop for their family will understand that the price of household items has skyrocketed just over the last 4 years. I think the other thing is the dynamic around organized retail theft. that these items being taken and then resold on bigger platforms like the Amazons and the eBays, without checks and balances. Those things are real dynamics that get ignored. But this narrative that it is simply because Prop 47, because we have this $950 threshold, that people are taking advantage of it. Well, it took 11 years for folks to realize that this was a loophole, air quotes, that they could use to commit a crime with no penalty. That is false. In fact, it's a lie. Um, as far as I know, theft is still a crime in California, whether it is felony or misdemeanor, and folks can still be cited and held accountable. But the question is, why is that not happening?
And in a lot of cases, there have been all these high profile videos that come out of people going on quote unquote shopping sprees in places like San Francisco. And most of those are end up being charged as felony anyway, because anything organized can be charged under conspiracy law, which I have my own problems with. A lot of these cases, they're stealing way more than $950 worth of merchandise. And in a lot of cases, it bleeds into things like burglary and robbery and things that can be charged as a felony anyway. I haven't seen a lot of cases, where the DA wasn't able to figure out a way to charge a major retail theft as an actual felony.
Exactly. So there's a lot of conflating of issues and sensationalizing issues, especially in the media. And let's not leave out social media. I mean, we're at an age right now, technological age, where a lot of folks become journalists simply when they pick up their phones and press record, and create a story. And so, for the average person who is seeing these things, of course, it's alarming. And then to have this narrative placed on top of it that this is all happening because there's a piece of legislation that was passed that encourages lawlessness is a complete lie. The truth is that we have to look at these issues more holistically. To your point, organized retail theft is a crime. Theft is still a crime, right? And then, I've seen some videos of, there was a video of someone, I think in Oakland or maybe in the East Bay, where someone did a smash and grab at an Apple store. One of those products probably would have qualified for a felony. But they grabbed several iPhones and other devices and left the store. And there was literally a police car parked in front, an empty police car. So I think, those things are really interesting to see when this narrative is put on top of it. Playing on folks' desperation and their fears about safety is just the wrong approach.
And one of the points you made in your statement last week, which I covered the other side's press conference last week, and you had DAs and other law enforcement leaders and business leaders, and nobody points this out. Crime is actually down.
Yes, it is. Crime is down. But it's easier to play off of um, this narrative right now. And, you got to be honest about where we are, especially after the pandemic. Pointing to the things that I said earlier in the conversation, there's, many communities that have been destabilized. We do see more people on the streets. Unfortunately, we do see more people who are untreated. We see, a shortage in the access to treatment beds and shelter beds. These things are alarming. And so when we start talking about crime and violence, a lot of folks are associating these other kind of public health and society issues with crime and violence. People feel unsafe when they see people unhoused and ill. When they do see, small, low level crimes happening, it feels very much like what's going on. But then the facts get left out of it. And the fact is, yes, crime is down. We've seen a lot of electeds kind of walk back statements over the past couple of months who were out in front of cameras saying, crime is out of control. We've seen a rise. And then we had a CJ report that said not only is crime down, but we also have police who are not making arrests for the crimes that are being committed. So those are really important things that, get left out when the average person is, watching the news or listening to the radio and hearing and seeing all these things happening.
And I think one of the most important things, and you kind of hit on it during your introduction, can you discuss the nexus between safety and criminal justice reform and why mass incarceration doesn't make us safer?
Well, I think there's a little known fact for, people who are on the outside of this issue and just kind of watching it around criminal justice reform. One is that when someone receives a felony conviction, they live with over 40,000 lifetime legal restrictions. Those legal restrictions include things like access to housing, right? If you have certain types of felonies, you're not eligible or maybe not even welcome, regardless of what discrimination laws say, to apply for certain types of housing. Excuse me. Employment, right? I think California and specific pockets of California have been more progressive about like banning the box and people having to disclose criminal records, but we still see that as a long-term barrier. And even basic things like being able to show up for your kids' little league or, coach a team, open a daycare center. And these are lifetime restrictions, sometimes for things that people were convicted of decades ago, right? Or may not even been a direct offender, but may have been associated or nearby. Um, and so these things are important because when you have hundreds of thousands of people, and sometimes in very concentrated communities where we see an overrepresentation of people who have been to jail and prison or impacted by the war on drugs, we have whole communities of people who are disenfranchised, who are second class citizens. How does this make any of us safe? I've seen stats about the unhoused population, specifically in San Francisco. The majority of folks who are unhoused also have past convictions. So this is important when we talk about safety, right? If we're talking about individuals who don't have an opportunity to onboard as full citizens, have an opportunity to get housing, to get employment, to stabilize their lives, then how can the rest of society feel or experience safety in that way? It's important for us to not just look at um, this issue about criminal justice reform, about whether or not people are getting away with things. The issue of crime and violence is much more complicated and nuanced than that. And the issue of accountability is something that we have to look at. Do we want accountability that's only focused on punishment, or do we want accountability that also encourages rehabilitation and creates opportunities for folks to move through those barriers? When we look at accountability and justice that way, we have better outcomes in community. We have proof of that, right? Just as much as we have proof of what the war on drugs and three strikes laws and tougher sentencing has done, not just for specific communities that were overrepresented, like the Black and Brown communities, but for all communities. It has contributed to a lack of safety for all of us. But if we look at accountability and rehabilitation, and we look at criminal justice reform as an opportunity for us to right size the kind of approaches we need to these types of problems, then we see better outcomes for everyone.
And I make this point all the time. It just seems like if we wanted to intentionally make it difficult for people that get involved in the carceral system to get themselves out and to be productive citizens and to stay out of trouble, we couldn't design it intentionally to make it harder.
Exactly. Yeah, I got what you're saying. But yeah, it's we have to think about it from the standpoint of what outcome do we want to see, right? Um, and for folks who have had experience in the carceral system, many will tell you, and I know because I spend a lot of time in jails and prisons throughout California talking to individuals who are residents in these facilities, that it wasn't going to jail or prison that changed their lives. For those who are participating in programs and doing things to rehabilitate, It was the fact that they finally had access and had an opportunity to participate in those types of programs, to get clean, right? To deal with the underlying issues of trauma or unaddressed mental health, right? That unfortunately in jail and prison was the first time they actually had access. Why would we need to wait for someone to go to jail or prison to get access to mental health treatment or to get access to rehabilitation for drugs and alcohol treatment? Why would we need this to be the first time for folks to have a conversation about changing their mindsets, right? We want to see those things happen before people go to jail or prison. But if we're talking about accountability, we have to make sure that accountability includes rehabilitation and it creates an opportunity for folks to restore their citizenship over time or to restore their rights over time, because that is directly connected to our collective safety. Having people walk around with long-term barriers and unaddressed trauma and addiction, and not treating it and looking at it as a disease or a long-term public health issue that we have to address is dangerous for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that we would want to release somebody from prison and not allow them to get a job, not allow them to get housing. That seems like the opposite of the approach that we need to take. And yet that's what we've done for a long time.
Yeah, I think this other notion, especially in this proposed ballot initiative, is about forcing treatment and forcing participation. Listen, if you have ever had anyone struggling with addiction in your family, and I have, unfortunately, I lost a brother, um, and one of my well, I've lost several brothers, unfortunately, but one of my brothers struggled with addiction, and he actually got addicted to opiates while in jail. So there's this notion that when people go to jail, they go to jail to get better, and that there's no crime, and that they're in a controlled environment. People have access to drugs in jail. People have access to contraband, contrary to popular belief. And even through prescribed medication, right? We see that happen with people who are on the outside who get an injury. These drugs come with warnings, right? And so, unfortunately, my brother fell victim to that. And in the years that he struggled with his addiction while he was alive, um, it didn't matter how much we wanted him to get better. It didn't matter how many times he got arrested. It was a personal choice that he had to make. And he had to have options for the type of treatment that he felt was going to be most effective for him. And he tried to advocate for that, but that type of treatment wasn't always available to him. For an addict who feels like they need to be in an environment where they're in a residential facility, to only be offered, drop in or outpatient treatment, if they know for themselves that this is not going to work, we have to honor that. But unfortunately, we don't have a system that is responsive to what folks say they need to get better. And then we don't have enough access, right? That's a real issue. So how does arresting someone and mandating them and forcing them into treatment work if we don't have the treatment infrastructure or the options available that folks know they need to get better? That is a common sense conversation that's getting left out of this political debate. So we have to start digging a little deeper, right? We all have friends and families and neighbors and loved ones who struggle with these kinds of barriers, whether they do it publicly or privately. And we know the struggles that they go through with trying to get access to help, whether it's mental health treatment or housing or addiction services. We can't ignore that when these types of dangerous legislations or ballot initiatives are introduced, saying that we have a cure-all pill that's going to erase this issue. The cure-all is warehousing people in jail and prison, and we already know that doesn't work.
So, in terms of reforms and Prop 47, what do we do instead of what's being proposed?
I think what we do is we keep building the replacement. And I want to be clear that there's a huge debate, ongoing debate, right, about criminal justice reform. Again, I want to emphasize we are not saying when you hear criminal justice reform, we are not saying that we don't want accountability. What we're saying is that we want accountability that leads to long-term safety and the right kind of results. And that means that we can't over rely on one agency or one system to give us that. We have public health issues like addiction and mental illness, then we need to be investing in public health approaches, public health programs, access to those programs so that folks can get the treatment that they need. If we are talking about people who are destabilized because they're unhoused, we can't create a one size fits all system for that. There are lots of different needs for folks who are unhoused, and just because someone's unhoused doesn't mean that that they are addicted or that they have a mental health issue. There's a housing crisis in California, right? So we should, when we talk about criminal justice reform, what we're talking about is creating more opportunities and avenues for us to improve public safety by not over relying on policing, jails, and prisons and prosecution. Even folks who work in the criminal justice system agree that they are not equipped and don't have all of the resources to deal with the issues that they're being faced with when we are dealing with folks who are caught up in these systems, right? That these folks need access to housing, they need access to treatment, they need stabilization for their families. So we're doing reform work with the intention of building other systems infrastructures to be able to respond to those issues, to be able to do that not just at the county level and the state level, but at the community level. We know that people are better served when they can get that treatment, they can get that access right in their own neighborhood, right in their own community. And so that is what we are doing, right? We're working to move legislation and create smart solutions that give us more options to be able to help folks and to make that help accessible to them in communities. Things like trauma recovery centers, right, which we have been able to expand over the past decade in California. When we started this work, when Prop 47 was passed in 2014, we had 2 trauma recovery centers in this state. Now we have 24 across California. We've seen increased funding go to programs for victims and survivors to help them stabilize after they experience harm. We've seen money going into reentry programs that help people when they are released from jail or prison and prevent them from returning, right? Because they help them remove barriers to get access to jobs or into, long-term residential housing, supportive housing, right? These are the types of things that we want to see happen that create safety. And that's the spirit of reform. Reform says there are better ways that we can do this that are more cost effective and that give us better long-term results for safety in our communities.
I like the way you said that, because that's the way I feel, is that what we've done for too long doesn't work well, and it's very expensive. And there are just better ways to do it. I mean, when you get people treatment and when you get them education, it's amazing how far down that recidivism rate goes.
Absolutely. Everyone's life is better improved when they have access to education and opportunity. I mean, it's the reason why, um, when you talk about the spending, $50 billion a year, right? Nationally, in California, $14 billion a year going into the criminal justice system every year. Less than 1% of that goes to the needs of victims and survivors who have been harmed. We see, survivors struggling to try to, stabilize their lives or going through a complicated reimbursement system so that they can, recoup costs for time off of work or having to relocate. That's a problem. Imagine if we gave more, right, to help folks recover. Imagine if we gave more to education. Imagine if we gave more to just simply increase the number of treatment beds that are available. We've had a shortage in the number of treatment beds in California for almost a decade, right? And so these are important things to keep reiterating because it's much easier, quite frankly, for us, it's much more cathartic for people who are frustrated or afraid to say, we've had enough. This is lawlessness. What we need to do is just lock people up and show them that you can't behave this way, right? That we won't tolerate it, that it's unacceptable. If you do the crime, you do the time. Well, the truth is, crisis becomes crime in California. Unaddressed crisis becomes crime. So if we can do the right thing and address the crisis in the right way, we will see a reduction in crime. And we have decades of evidence, we have data that gets ignored, right? That proves it. To your point earlier, crime is down. Crime is down because the savings that we have reallocated from Prop 47 has gone to effective programs that have helped people transform their lives and stabilize their lives. But that's not getting any credit right now, right? Like that's not getting any visibility in this conversation.
Well, we'll end our segment there. Tinisch, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that. I think you explained it so well. I have to
My
say.
job. Thank you.
We've been talking with Tinisch Hollins. She's the executive director of Californians for Safety and Justice. I really recommend people listen to this conversation because it's such an important thing for people to understand that criminal justice reform means putting things in place instead of just throwing somebody in a cage. And throwing somebody in a cage is expensive and it doesn't work very well. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.